Hi, and welcome to ILC webinar on Can Cycling and Walking Help Release the Longevity Dividend? Really pleased we've got a brilliant panel of people coming and joining us today. Before we get started though, a few housekeeping rules. We may have some issues with internet. I know I've just had some, although my son, I have to say my son is not at home at the moment, so there is no risk that him streaming Billie Eilish or 100 gecs will destroy my internet. So we're probably safe at my end, but who knows? At the bottom of the screen, you'll see a chat function with some Q&A, with a Q&A feature. Please put some questions in as we're going along. Also, feel free to upvote your favorite question. If you're having any issues with the audio or video, please do, you can disconnect and read the same link. We are broadcasting this on YouTube, and we'll put it on our website afterwards. So I know some people do watch live on YouTube as well. Just a quick introduction about ILC UK. ILC UK are the specialist think tank on the impact of longevity on society. We are independent and politically neutral. We seek to use evidence-based research to support public policy change, and really focused on, so it's three big areas, how we make sure that we maximize the benefit of longevity, the economic and social benefit, how we ensure longer lives are good for everyone, and how we future-proof policy and practice. We're a member of a network of 16 ILCs across the world, so have a global reach. And I know over the first 5 or 6 webinars we've done, we've had people from over, I think we're up to about 50 different countries who have joined us. Hence one of the reasons we always start these at the middle of the day. We are supported by our partners program, and there you will see some of the members of our partners program who benefit from business intelligence, some networks and connections, and some brand benefits as well. So please do, if you are interested in working with us or commissioning research, get in touch. Today we're going to talk about the importance of cycling and walking for all ages, and this is extremely important issue. I think what we know is that active travel works, and we know it works for younger people and it works for older people. And yet we also know that our travel horizons fall as we age. We tend to travel a little bit less. It's partly driven by work, actually, but we tend to travel a bit less. But particularly for women, there is a fall in walking and cycling. So whilst we know there is a big health benefit potentially from walking and cycling, and we know that active travel actually works, it seems as though as we get older we do it less, and the idea today is for us to talk a bit about why that happens and what we can do about it. But I think it's also important for us to recognize the economic argument here. The work we've been doing on the longevity dividend has really been focused on the fact we've got more and more older people, and older people spending 54 pence in the pound in high streets and in town centres. We've got to make sure that this group of the population is able to continue to contribute economically. And it may well be, for example, that some older people are reluctant to get on public transport at the moment in the context of COVID, and may actually see cycling and walking as an option, as a way of them getting back into the town centre. So I'm not going to say very much else by way of an introduction, except sort of pass you over to our first speaker, who is Susan Claris from Arup. Susan is a transport planner and an anthropologist who's worked with Arup for 25 years. She is Arup's global champion for active travel and led the reports towards a walking world, and has co-authored a recent report on cycling for everyone with Sustrans. Susan.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that introduction, and it's great to be with you today. If we can move on to the first slide, please. So I want to talk about focus on walking and cycling and older people. As David mentioned, I'm a transport planner at Arup, and I'm also Vice President of Living Streets, which is the UK charity for everyday walking. And the photograph there is me and my partner's father, Frank, who I will hopefully end with an anecdote about Frank if I'm within my 15 minutes. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. what I really want to do is three things. To start off with some stats, because I always think that's a helpful way to start a conversation. To touch briefly on the benefits of walking and cycling for older people themselves, but also for the streets, the places where we live, and for the planet. And then to focus on some actions, what we can do to improve walking and cycling for older people. And the photograph there is Dame Olivia de Havilland on her tricycle at the age of 104, sadly taken, I think, only a couple of months before she died. But I love the joy of that photograph, and I think it demonstrates well that cycling is a viable mode of transport for older people. Next slide, please. So if we start off with some stats, next slide, these are taken from the Department for Transport's National Travel Survey. And I'll talk you through them. The first one is about car, bus and train trips. And you can see, obviously this is 2019, so it's pre-COVID, but the car trips, you've got the number of trips going up the graph. Along the bottom, you've got ages, and I've circled the bits in red to hopefully make it the over 70s to make that easier to see. So you can see that people over the age of 70 do make fewer car trips than some younger people, but there's not a huge difference. The bigger difference is the graph bottom left, which is the distance. So you can see they're making, not that many less trips, but they are making much shorter trips in terms of the mileage. And then if we look at bus, which is top right, you can see bus use increases. And I think that's why it's particularly relevant, as David was just saying, in COVID times, if people are feeling unsure about using public transport. And you can see that women are using bus more than men. And then if you look at rail trips, which is bottom right, not surprisingly, there is quite a decrease because a lot of rail usage is associated with journeys to work and with commuting. So there's a big tail off there. So if we move to the next slide, which looks at walking and cycling, walking on the left there, you can see that there is a slight decrease, but it's not a huge decrease in the number of trips made by people over the age of 70. But interestingly, you do see it's the only age group in which men make more walking trips than women. And if you look at cycling, the graph on the right, you can see there is quite a deterioration or reduction in the number of cycling trips. Again, much more for women, but women typically make fewer cycling trips than men do. And the stat very bottom right is looking at the number of people with access to a bicycle by age. And for the over 60s, only 24% of people over the age of 60 have access to a bike. Again, I said all of these are figures from last year, and as we know, there's been a big increase in bike sales. So it will be very interesting to see how these figures change in future years. So if we move on to the next slide, which looks at the actual purposes of trips. So this one actually quite surprised me. The graph on the left shows shopping trips per person by age and gender. And actually, the group that makes the most shopping trips is men over the age of 70. And I was astounded by that. So that's a big increase for men in terms of shopping. And if you look at leisure trips, again, there's not much difference for people over the age of 70. So people are out there, they're doing the shopping trips, they're doing the leisure trips, but they're doing them far more by car than by walking and cycling. So that's the sort of the stats background. If we move on now to the looking at benefits of walking and cycling, and I said I'm dividing that into sort of people, places and planet. So if we look at benefits for older people themselves of more walking and cycling, I think health and wealth are two major ones. So the graph on the left is from Public Health England, and it shows the benefits of regular physical activity. And for many people, and I think particularly for older people, walking and cycling are the best ways of getting daily physical activity in your life. For most people, and I say particularly for older people, it isn't going to the gym or it isn't playing five-a-side football or whatever. It could be playing golf, but it's if you're doing something on a regular basis, 2 10-minute bursts of activity a day, walking is one of the best ways of doing it. And there are massive benefits for both physical health and mental health. Physical activity is associated with preventing a drop in cognitive decline, reducing the chance of diabetes, reducing the chance of depression by up to 48%, reducing all-cause mortality by 30%. It's no wonder Public Health England talks about walking and cycling as sort of being a miracle pill or a miracle drug in terms of the benefits. So real benefits for people themselves, and also benefits in terms of wealth. So these figures are, figure on the right is from the Office of National Statistics, looking at national household expenditure from 2019. And if you set aside mortgage payments and rent, transport is actually the biggest item of household expenditure. People are spending more money on transport than they do on food per week, 13.7% across all ages. And if we look at the particular ages on older people, For people aged 65 to 74, they're spending 16% of their household expenditure on transport. Of people aged over 75, it's 11%. So it's a significant amount of money. So direct benefits for people, if we look next at places, for residential streets that have people walking and cycling are healthier, happier streets where people know their neighbours. There is reduced social isolation. So more walking and cycling by everybody, and particularly by older people, leads to better streets for us all to live. And it leads to better town centres. David mentioned the amount of money that sort of older people are spending. And it's always been the myth that the people who spend the most are the people with cars because they have the money, but there's strong research from Transport for London, from Living Streets and for others, this isn't just a London thing, that people who walk to town centres spend more than people who drive there. So very strong in terms of the high street. And then if we move on to the benefits for the planet, transport is the largest emitting sector of greenhouse gas emissions. So there are very strong carbon benefits if we can displace the very high number of short trips that take place by car and replace them with walking and cycling. So London stats, 1 in 3 car journeys in London is shorter than a kilometre. 1 in 7 car journeys in London is shorter than, so 1 in 3 is shorter than 2 kilometres, 1 in 7 is shorter than a kilometre. So there are an awful lot of really short car trips that could be walked and cycled. There are benefits for the environment as well. Walking and cycling has no adverse impacts on the environment, unlike the short car trips. And I put the picture of the goldfinch there because for me that's been one of the birds of lockdown, particularly in the spring when there was the blue skies and the sunshine, and people were hearing the birds, watching the birds, and appreciating them in a new way. And I was seeing finches on my daily walk, and it was a real highlight of the day. And then also there's benefits in terms of equality. Walking and cycling are both very sort of equal modes in terms of people, particularly walking. I think, you know, we are all equals when it comes to walking. There aren't second class carriages or anything. There's no thing about status or wealth. So there's strong benefits in terms of equality. So that's in terms of the benefits. So the next question is what do we do? How do we improve walking and cycling for older people? And for me, the first thing is really having a sort of this modal hierarchy where walking comes at the absolute top. I would always put walking above cycling, because virtually everybody walks. And I said it's a question of encouraging people to walk more. So walking in all its modes, so including people who are walking with frames or with sticks, in wheelchairs, buggies, whatever, scooters. Then cycling, and again making sure we look at cycling in its many diverse forms. Then public transport, then taxis, freight and servicing, and we have private vehicles at the bottom of that hierarchy. So it's really setting that up as a measure by which all other policies are judged against. To move on to the next slide, please. And as David mentioned, we've just produced this report with Sustrans called Inclusive Cycling, and it's a quirk pretty much of the UK, not by many other countries, that cycling is dominated by a certain demographic, which is typically a sort of a white professional male, 20s to 40s. And certainly in London, men outnumber women cycling, and outside, but I've just got more stats for London because Transport for London have been collecting them for longer. So this particular report looked at cycling for underrepresented groups of people, which is older people, which in this case was identified as people 65 and over, women, disabled people, people from BAME backgrounds, and people from on low incomes. And fully appreciate those are not sort of singular silos. Some people will, and particularly older people, will probably be in more than more than 2 or 3, maybe all of those groups. And what we're saying is what can we do to make cycling for everybody? And we looked at 3 main areas: improving governance, planning and decision making, creating better places, and then welcoming and support all people. So if you go on to the next slide about governance, planning and decision making, what we said is we really need to design walking and cycling strategies that plan to address how they reduce inequity and then be evaluated against this. I think in cycling we've moved from sort of outputs of put down 2 kilometers of cycle lane and that's fine, to then saying, okay, well let's see a bit more outcomes and see how many people use them, and if you have 100 people using it, it's better than 50 people using it. But now we need to look more at the sort of people who are using it, and more importantly who aren't. We need to increase diversity and representation in decision making in the transport sector. Transport sector is typically 80% male. We need to improve decision making through better evidence and public engagement, and we need to be more creative about how we do this so people do feel more involved in the process. The second recommendation was about better places for everyone to walk and cycle in. Improving road safety is a really important part of this, having protected space for walking and cycling, having low traffic neighbourhoods, which are being introduced at the moment, amongst some controversy in some places. We need to address personal safety and harassment, and a lot of this is about people's fear of doing something rather than the actual stats of doing it. And we need to make sure that all walking and cycling infrastructure is fully inclusive. And then the third recommendation is about giving support and welcoming all people to walk and cycle. This is around things like using inclusive language and imagery. So I always try and refer to cycles, not bikes, because cycles come in many shape and form. It's not the traditional two-wheel bicycle all the time. And ensure walking and cycling is welcoming and celebrates diversity. And you tend to see on the news when there's talk about active travel, the imagery is firstly nearly always of cycling, not walking. And then secondly, it will typically be a white male cyclist, typically with all the gear on, cycling in a certain way. So people don't see cycling as something that is an activity for people like them. And that's what the graph on the right shows, is that for the different demographic groups, and you've got the older people at the bottom, 30% of older people did not associate cycling as an activity for people like them. And only 18% of those who do not cycle said they would like to start, much lower than amongst the other underrepresented groups. We also need to ensure that cost is not a barrier to access a cycle, particularly if you need any form of specialised cycle or tricycle, because they can be quite expensive, and offer free cycle training for children, but also for adults. People will be maybe going back to cycling after a long time away and they need that training. Next slide, please. So I think the other thing is, and this is more focusing on walking, is looking at the impact of small changes and the difference they can make. And this is very powerfully put together by some of the project work that Living Streets has done. And they did a project in Sutherland Street in Edinburgh called Walking Connects. And this was where there was a sheltered housing, and the pavement outside was very cracked and people were tripping. And over the years, over a series of 20 years, the people who ran the house and some of the residents had tried to get the council to change it, but they didn't know how to engage with the council properly and nothing happened. And eventually, through Living Streets, working with the residents, working with the management, and then engaging with the local councillor, change happened. But it took so long, and it took people actually falling and being hospitalised to make it happen. And I think one way around this can be for council members to have budgets for small work, so things don't have to go into the massive pot of what happens council wide. Individual councillors can make small changes. Next slide, please. I think land use planning has a role. I was very interested to watch the Channel 4 programme, Old People's Home for 4-year-olds, where they took an old person's home and they introduced children from a local nursery into the home and measured what the impact was in terms of things like activity and happiness. And it was very marked that by having that engagement with the children, the residents were far more active. And one of the outcomes from that programme was the recommendation to co-locate care homes and nurseries. Don't have care homes on the edge of towns where you don't see anybody. So that for me was a very interesting piece of work. Next slide, please. And I think really what it comes down to is what sort of streets and places do we want. So those two photographs there, I walk daily, particularly during lockdown, and take photographs of what I see. I'm staying down in Folkestone at the moment, and these are two streets not far away. So the one on the left has a bench, has a grass verge, has trees, has some cars, is a pleasant place to walk. The one on the right is what I refer to as transport gluttony. It's where transport is being greedy and not only takes up its own space, it takes up other spaces. And for me, that was a prime example of the way the footway was blocked. And yes, I did get chased down the road after taking that photograph by the man whose cars it was, because he wasn't very happy with me. So it's about having pedestrian crossings. It is about having more benches. It's the importance of public toilets. It's reducing car dominance in terms of the numbers of cars, the size of cars, the speed of cars, the noise of cars. It's about preventing pavement parking. It's having parklets taking over single parking spaces and making them little green oases and having benches. It's the importance of maintenance, and it's the importance of small changes. And to conclude, just with the story of Frank on my last slide, if I may. So my background, as David mentioned, I'm an anthropologist as well as a planner, and I think it's always really important to see it from the individual's point of view. So Frank is now in his mid-80s, and up until the point he was 80, he walked well, he walked every day. He lives in Cork, and he would walk in the local fields. And then he found that there was a woman who was always walking at the same time with him, and he didn't like her attention. It made him feel uncomfortable. And rather than actually telling her this or choosing somewhere else to walk or a different type of day, he just stopped walking. because he felt uncomfortable doing it. And unfortunately, since then, his legs have really deteriorated and he now finds walking very difficult. So I think it's always really important to look at the human side, what motivates us as individuals. So thank you very much for listening.
Great, thank you so much, Susan. I've got lots and lots of questions and issues that have come up for me, but I will perhaps bring those up at the end. Please, as I said earlier, please do put your questions into the Q&A. We've had some via email as well that came in advance, but if you put them in the Q&A, that allows you to upvote them. I'm going to pass on to Dr. Ian Walker, who works at the University of Bath and does research onto road safety, travel choices, energy consumption, water and the built environment, and actually has a book out. So I have to say, if Ian, if you haven't chosen the opportunity to flag a photo of your book, then it's a real missed opportunity. You've got one there to weigh. Good. Ian.
Thank you very much. Yes, obviously you all need a copy of this. This is breaking the world record for crossing Europe on a bike, which unfortunately I was very aware of being the sort of 40-something white man that Susan was talking about on a bike in tight gear, which is literally pictures on the front of that book. So I'm very much the problem. But actually today I'm going to talk about something slightly different. So when they asked me to speak today, I sort of metaphorically clicked my heels, because for the last couple of years I've been sat on some data about older people's experiences of being pedestrians, and I thought, oh, thank goodness, finally I've got a chance to actually dust out these data and share them with people who might find them useful. So there's a kind of a good and a bad here. It's good in that I can finally share these data and show you what we found when we asked older people to talk about their experiences of walking around the city. The bad is that some of the original documents are locked away in the university and I can't get them because of lockdown. So if you've got really specific questions, like what's the exact number of people that you interviewed, I possibly can't answer them today because some of the documents are locked in my office and I can't get at them. But with that caveat noted, let me give you a quick rundown on what we did and what we found. So we can just go to the next slide, please. We were interested to speak to older people who live in the city of Bath. You know, if stereotypes are to be believed, there's quite a lot of them. And we wanted to get a feel for their experiences of walking around the city, with a particular view to identifying any facilitators or barriers that might come up in quite spontaneous conversation. And just to jump ahead to the findings very slightly, we found rather more barriers than facilitators. So the bulk of what I'm going to show you today is things that need fixing rather than things that are going well at the moment. So Bath, I'm sure quite a lot of you will have visited. If you haven't, then I'm sure our local MP would really like me to ask you to do so as quickly as possible, because our economy relies on it quite heavily. It's a historic city. It's a World Heritage Site with a very clear heart. It's got a relatively small city centre full of shops and tourist attractions, all eminently walkable for somebody with reasonable mobility. It's got a central river which has footpaths and provides a nice route in and out of the city. Especially notably, there's a very, very large new housing development just on the western side of the city, which is accessible using the riverside footpaths. And so potentially we've got a new pedestrian route running straight in and out of the city. And of course, we've got two quite substantial universities on either side of the city, and quite a major tourist industry that we rely on quite a lot. So that's the context for those of you who've not seen the city. What we did is we got in touch with Age UK, and through them we contacted quite a few participants and invited them to have a chat about their experiences of walking in the city. Bath is horribly hilly, as someone just noted. Yes, hills will appear in the findings, you'll be pleased to see. Now, what's really important with this kind of interviews where you're trying to elicit people's experiences, it's really important to try and do these in a way where you don't lead people, where you're not pushing people to agree with statements. So the interviews were structured to be really deliberately as open as possible at the start. So we would begin with very, very general questions like, tell me about a typical day in your life. So we'd start with extremely broad open questions because as much as anything else, that helps us avoid leading people to just focus on particular issues. But also it's great for showing you what is on the forefront of people's minds. So if you say to somebody, tell me about a typical day, and the first thing they say is, oh, well, usually my days are ruined because I can't walk because of all the cars parked on the pavement, then that's quite a good insight into how important this thing is for them or how salient it feels for them. So we did these very open, freely discussions where we tried as much as possible not to push people onto particular topics. And then we also had several paper maps of the city, which we used partway through the interviews to encourage people to focus on specific locations, specific routes. We'd say, show me where you live, show me where you tend to go, where might you visit as you go out of the house, how might you get there? Can you point at the places where you have particular issues or anything like that? So we did all of these interviews, recorded all of those, transcribed them, a bit like that example on the screen, and then studied them for themes. So every sentence or statement that people uttered would get coded based on what the topic of that statement was. And then we'd pull all that together and have a look at what it means. And next slide, please. Now, what we found, and I'll show you a diagrammatic version of this in a second, we found that pretty much all the statements that people made as they talked about their experiences of being pedestrians in Bath fell into three broad categories, which we called environmental, individual, and interpersonal. And this was three broad categories of experience of the outside world, which seemed really prevalent and repeated in the discussions with older pedestrians. So anything I'm about to show you came up more than once and can be viewed as a theme in the discussions that we had. If we can just go to the next slide. I don't know how well you'll be able to see this, but this is the diagram that we pulled together to try and illustrate the three. So over on the left-hand side in blue, these are all the environmental things. These are all the topics that came up several times that could be described as part of the physical environment. And I think as you'll see, if you can see that, it is fundamentally relatively negative. It is relatively a list of, here are things about the physical world that stop me walking or make it difficult for me to walk. So hills are on there somewhere. Where are they? Oh yeah, the hills have actually got their own little tab there for Maggie. They came up as a special topic because Bath is situated in a bowl of hills. But there's quite a lot of other physical barriers that were mentioned in the environment. Bridges being a problem, slippery, irregular surfaces, blocked routes came up a lot, blocked by parked cars, as in Susan's photograph, overgrown paths or paths that are not sufficient for the job. And then motor traffic, unsurprisingly, came out as a particular barrier. The danger, the fumes, the noise. As we all know, motor traffic can make the outside world an unpleasant place, and that was definitely reflected in the discussions that we had with people here. Also quite a rich topic of discussion was pedestrian crossings. Some people did talk about these as being useful, and there were certainly people who say, I could never cross the road, or even I could never get to the shops, I could never get to where I need to go if it weren't for pedestrian crossings. But at the same time, a lot of the specific discussion was quite negative about the need to wait, the fact that it makes your journey very stop-start, the inconvenience of having to stop and give way and request permission to cross the road came up. So that's all the kind of physical, environmental stuff that came up. There's then a category of individual things. So this was the things tied to the particular person or the particular journey. So for example, people talked about age and talked about how as they had grown older themselves, they saw changes in how they walked and how they were able to walk. And they talked about shifts in their own needs as they aged, which was quite an interesting reflection of people's self-awareness. They also very clearly talked about different categories of trip motives. And this is interesting for anybody who's got a background in transport research. You're probably aware that transport researchers very often talk about these different motives, in particular, functional journeys versus more discretionary journeys. And this was very, very clear in the discussions that people were coming up with. They definitely talked about journeys of necessity to get to the shops, to get to the doctors, things like this. But a really clear theme, which echoes the work of Charles Musselwhite, if any of you know his work, a really clear theme that came up was the absolute importance of being able to walk just for pleasure, and the intrinsic pleasure of being able to go out under your own steam and experience the outside world, to experience green space, to enjoy peace and quiet and social interactions. All of those things came up. And as you might know, if you've looked at Charles Musselwhite's work that I just mentioned, one of the issues with this is older people often find it very hard to ask for that. What they found in the previous research is people find it quite easy to ask for help to achieve functional journeys, like going to the shops, going to the doctors. People find it much harder to ask for help to just go for pleasure trips. But what we saw from talking to people was just how important those pleasure trips were for quality of life. The final set of factors that we found, which I think are quite interesting, is the interpersonal set of factors, which is in dark green on the top right here. And basically what this was is, you can see that the list of topics that was included here is almost as rich as the list of topics for the physical world. But this is, again, a world that's maybe not talked about so much. This is the social world. This is a direct parallel to the physical world and how the physical world might help or hinder a person's walking. What we saw here was very clearly the social world can help or hinder a person's walking. And in particular, it was hindrance. So you'll see that almost all of the things on that list there are negatives. There was a lot of discussion of feeling intimidated in public places because of outsider groups. For example, groups of tourists, groups of students, groups of young people, cyclists were intimidating. There was a lot of talk of feeling intimidated about walking because of public nuisance like homelessness, drunkenness, and crime. These were fears that were raised regularly. And so if we jump on a slide, I fear those slides, we can jump on to the next diagram, in fact, because I've basically talked about these slides. So if we jump on one more, this is then, so those three categories describe the topics that arose repeatedly as we talked to people. The other thing we looked at was how people, what strategies and tactics people use to cope with those barriers that they talked about. And as you can see, there's far less. People talked much less about the strategies they had at their disposal for dealing with this. Probably the dominant strategy that people used was to think about their routes. And if anything, this really emphasizes the need for people to have a menu of routes available to them. Routes that can avoid traffic, routes that allow for flexibility and variety, because nobody wants to just do the same route over and over and over again. And routes, critically, that allow interaction with green spaces. You can see we've got biophilia marked as a theme there. People really want routes that are pleasant to walk in. Perhaps the dominant thing that came, well, not dominant, but perhaps the most striking thing for me that came out of this discussion in terms of how people cope with the perceived barriers of walking was this very powerful phenomenon, which was, I think, every single person we spoke to never went out at night. This was a very clear recurrent theme. All trips were made in daylight. because of fear of the social world that I talked about. Fear of crime, fear of drunkenness, fear of large groups of outsider people. People just talked over and over again about staying at home at night because of these perceived barriers. So we just jump on. And one more, please. So just to wrap this up and interpret this, as the human geographers have long argued, the physical world is hugely important. And when we spoke to older people about their experiences as pedestrians, a huge amount of what they talked about accordingly was about the physical world. They talked about the built environment and how that helped or hindered their journeys. But I think what we saw, and what's possibly the most important contribution of what we did here, is to say that as well as that physical world that helps and hinders people's walking trips, there's also a social world. There's a world of other people. And that can be just as much a barrier as an overgrown path, a parked car, or a non-existent pedestrian crossing. And we need to understand that the reality of going out for walking trips can be intimidating because of these physical and these social barriers that are maybe just as real. People do have some strategies for dealing with this, but in particular, probably the dominant one was a very negative strategy of just never going out at night. And with that, I will wrap up.
Great, thank you very much, Ian. It's great. The interpersonalizing is really, really strong one. And I do remember I did a focus group in the day centre once, and we were talking about the freedom pass, the free bus pass, and I said to one guy there, so it was with a group of all men. I said, so why what do you think of the bus? And his first answer was, I really hate it. The kids make a noise. They put their feet on the seats. They're really annoying. I get a bit scared. I said, when did you last go on a bus? Never been on a bus. So actually there was a perception of what it was like, even though they had not experienced it for actually 20 or 30 years in some cases. It's really interesting. I think the pedestrian crossing was like another anecdote. When we were clearing an office about 20 years ago, 15 years ago at Help the Aged, I found an old press release we had about pedestrian crossings from the 1970s. And it was a press release that talked about how long it takes to walk across relative to how long the green light is. And it was interesting, not least in that this press release said Mr. Jones of Southdown Avenue in Southwark. This was way before GDPR. Help the Aged were putting press releases out with names and addresses on. But actually, the fact that this is still the same issue that's still coming up even now is, I think, striking. That and clearly, when we've done some work around dementia, actually, the change in the design of the pedestrian crossing can be an issue for some people. So the move, I'm not very technical, but is it towards pelican crossings or away from them, where actually you can't see the green light anymore? Actually, some people struggle to understand how to use them anymore. But we'll probably come on to some of those things in questions. Let me now pass on to Susanna, who is actually doing what we should probably all be doing instead of sitting in a webinar at the moment. I think she's actually on a bike ride and has decided to stop for a little bit to join us. Suzanne is the cycling champion for Oxfordshire County Council, and in her professional life is a clinical research fellow at the University of Birmingham and an honorary consultant in public health. Well, I've got Public Health England here. I think they still exist formally at the moment. But Suzanne.
Thanks, David. It's a real pleasure to be here. And yes, I am outdoors, so it's raining. But yes, I'm on a cycle journey, not as far as Ian has travelled, but one of my own journeys. And I have to say that it's tremendously liberating just to be able to travel each day by bike. So I just wanted to pick up really on some of the key points from both a public health perspective in my professional capacity, but also from a decision maker in local authority in terms of how we can provide better representation, really, I think, for this demographic, which is obviously so important in terms of walking and cycling. I think, as we've heard already from Susan, the very, very, very clear. The evidence stacks up absolutely in terms of the environment, in terms of health, and of course the economy. And I think that is a really key element when we come back to thinking about the decision making, particularly at local authority level. I myself, I'm a doctor by background. We know that physical inactivity is a major risk to health. It's a major risk increasingly into later life, but we also know that a quarter of adults over age 16 are inactive, physically inactive, and not meeting Chief Medical Officer guidelines in terms of physical activity, 150 minutes minimum per week, and that really is a cause for concern, particularly if we unpick that further and look at the differences. And we know that among, as we've seen already from the data that Susan presented, among women that decline is more marked, particularly as we get to the older age groups, and also very, very clear ethnic differences in terms of Asian and Black minority ethnic groups being much less likely to meet physical activity guidance as adults in terms of minimum levels. And that really, again, is something which contributes to health inequity. And this really comes back to this fundamental issue that although we've seen increases in life expectancy, actually we've reached somewhat of a plateau. And looking at the compression of morbidity, we've got people living longer and longer period of time with chronic conditions. And this is something which, as a public health community, is really the major issue of our time, is trying to compress that morbidity and helping healthy life expectancy moving forwards. So I think we know from the very, very clear evidence in terms of reducing chronic disease risk across cardiovascular, respiratory, metabolic diseases, diabetes being a key one of those, obviously, that activity is absolutely key, and active travel is a key way to integrate that into everyday life. We know that it's a necessity in terms of making those journeys, and it's also a way to integrate that physical activity within those. In terms of coming back to the local authority perspective, certainly I think there is an increasing awareness of the importance of activity among the older age groups. I represent a division in a relatively rural area in Oxfordshire, but our population has a median age of 40. But we have many communities where there are 30 to 40% of people aged over 60, and actually the number of people aged over 85 is predicted to double through to 2021 from the last census. So we know that there is a very, very, we know we have an aging population, we know we have a rural population, many of whom also do experience transport poverty and do have difficulties in terms of accessing vital services. What I also wanted to say is that it is essentially those older people who we hear much less from when it comes back to the transport dialogue. And when we think about our responses to consultations locally, we do have say an overrepresentation from the middle-aged professional groups, and we're well aware of that. And I think this also picks up on Ian's point here that people find it more difficult to make that case if it is around recreational and walking for recreational purposes rather than to access vital services. So that is a concern in terms of how we listen and how we respond. I think that some of the key elements about decision making at a local level, and actually one of the most satisfying experiences that I had as a councillor was just achieving a path to a local cemetery. So I had a long-running correspondence with a resident who was unable to visit the grave. Her husband had died 2 years previously, and she hadn't been able to reach there. She didn't have access to a car, and using a local ward budget, I was actually able to link the nearest road by footpath to that cemetery. And I have to say that was one of the most satisfying minor achievements as a councillor, but something which is entirely overlooked because that cemetery was only accessible by car, essentially. And I think this is the key in terms of our local planning and development processes. We've created and generated these very car-dependent communities, and particularly when we get out to our smaller market towns and our villages, we've really locked elderly people into car dependency. And that really needs to radically change moving forwards. So other things in terms of what we're doing, I think Susan touched upon low traffic neighbourhoods, and that is something which has been included in our response to the emergency active travel funding coming through the central government scheme at present. So we have bid for a series of low traffic neighbourhoods. They are within Oxford City, and that's partly because of the case has been much stronger within the city as opposed to within the smaller market town areas. But that's not to say that those won't be a focus of attention moving forwards. I very much hope they will be implemented. I think getting that communication is absolutely key about the benefits. So one of the concerns we often have is that this is going to be detrimental to older people. It's going to affect their ability to access services. It's going to be a barrier for mobility. And I think all of those, we really need to work very strongly on the importance of the clear communication around the benefits, and communicate those to our decision makers who do have concerns, who do think that potentially these changes might disadvantage elderly people. And I think it's really important that we make that very clear. Also, coming back to this issue about our own portrayal around walking and cycling, and I think, again, we recently have been working with our comms team to actually focus upon using many different images around walking and cycling to include people of different ages, different demographics, and very much move away from this lycra-clad high-vis type cycling image in terms of the way in which we communicate about active travel. And I think that's a journey which we've just started. I wouldn't say we're completely there yet, but I think normalising this is just absolutely essential moving forwards if we're going to get that widespread acceptance of the fact that it's a normal way to get around, to walk or to take the bike. And I think finally, just to say that these small things make a huge difference. I mean, we've just undertaken a very radical maintenance programme which has been accelerated in terms of delivery, so cutting back vegetation, cleaning our footpaths, repairing our footpaths, and I have to say that has really resonated particularly with the older people in our community. I've received more correspondence about that than I have previously about other major sort of infrastructure schemes. So I think that incremental progress and bringing up to standard what we have has actually been really important. It's potentially less exciting for our decision makers who tend to really like the major capital projects, I have to say, but I think these things can make a huge difference. And as I mentioned, the experience with the cemetery path was very much the case, and just being able to make these paths accessible to people is really important. What I hope is that we'd like to have a much more ring-fenced maintenance budget for our paths, which we have for roads at the moment. I think walking and cycling has been very neglected in terms of maintenance. It tends to attach to the capital funding but not revenue, and I think that is really important, having that budget there moving forwards, and that's something I'd very much like to see within our authority. And pavement parking as well, and again, very high on the agenda. We're very much hoping for moves to be made at a national level there, but at a local level we are working with our PCSOs through our community policing team, neighbourhood team, and also looking at how successful stickers are on these cars, and really trying to work with the communities in terms of actually making the awareness that this really is an obstruction. It also is unsafe as well. So those small things I think really do make a difference, but definitely moving this forwards to an agenda where it is a normal way to get around, where it is accessible well into later life, and that it is beneficial for living healthier and longer lives. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Suzanne. I think one of the reasons we really wanted to do this session was because actually, and it's great to hear about so much about what's going on locally, but was that, of course, in the Prime Minister, we have someone who is an enthusiastic cyclist, but we also have, I think, in the Transport Minister and Transport Department, sort of words and press releases coming out centrally, which are perhaps more positive towards cycling and walking than we've seen for a long time. So there's actually quite an exciting opportunity, but the challenge, it seems, is to the extent to which that can be delivered locally. And it's great to hear what you're doing, but we'll probably come back to that. Tom, I've known for many years. Tom previously worked in financial services, so has worked in sort of aging and retirement from a different angle for a long time, but recently moved to be head of public affairs for Pure Electric. I should say, you know, the financial service industry hasn't, you know, there's lots of things the financial service industry doesn't have a brilliant reputation for, but I once was talking to, let's say, a representative body of an insurance industry, and I said, and they said to me, oh, well, we used to have those Santander keys in the office for staff, but then we were a bit worried about the insurance. We're a bit worried that might be a bit too risky for them, so for the staff, so we don't give them anymore. And you think, oh, you know, actually a recognition in the insurance industry that there might actually be lower risk for undertaking healthier activities seemed a long way from where they were, but that's me just being mean about the financial service industry. Tom.
Thank you, David, and for the avoidance of doubt, can I just emphasize I never worked for, well, I did work for an insurance company, but it was a very long time ago, and some risk is good in life, I think, generally. So that's me. I work for Pure Electric. We're a micro-mobility retailer. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm just coming at it from a slightly different angle from the previous speakers. I'm not going to talk much about walking because I think mostly we'll know what walking looks like and feels like. So I'm just going to talk about some of the other less familiar. Next slide, please. So micromobility, and specifically, can we just build up this slide, please? Okay, so pause there. Okay, fine. Okay, so what we've got there are a couple of electric scooters, and that gives you a sense of the kind of price range we're talking about here. So if you want to buy a micromobility solution, typically an adult electric scooter will start at around £400. I'll come back to the question of whether electric scooters constitute active travel or not in a moment. I think that's also quite an interesting question. A kind of more premium mainstream electric scooter will set you back typically around £600. These have a range of about 30 kilometers. They are somewhat dependent upon rider weight and temperature and gradient. They don't like hills particularly. But for cities like London, for someone that wanted to commute, say, up to perhaps 10 miles, they work extremely effectively. And also, like cycling, they're a lot of fun, and we shouldn't underestimate the importance of that as well. Electric bicycles start typically at around £1,000. So that G-Tech, that one bottom left, £995. That's pretty basic. It's got rim brakes, it doesn't have disc brakes, it doesn't have a computer readout on it. It's got a range of about up to perhaps 30 miles, but no rack. You know, it's pretty basic. So that's the entry-level electric bike. The one in the middle is a specialized, about £2,500 will buy you a bike that's got gears, that can carry luggage, that's got a computer readout, and has got a range of sort of 50 to 60 miles, and is therefore probably more suited to the kind of demographic that we're talking about here. It's also a little more comfortable than the G-Tech. I thought it was worth just highlighting the one on the bottom right, the Turn, which I absolutely love, and really sits on the boundary between, technically it's a cargo bike, but it sits on the boundary between domestic and commercial use. And I was in Bristol yesterday and bumped into a woman who was riding one of these, and I went over to chat to her, and she had a young child, I guess sort of maybe 5 or 6, sitting on the back on a child seat. And their family, they have 2 electric bikes, no car. They do all their shopping on this Turn bicycle. I think for a lot of households, this can provide an alternative to a car, or perhaps to a second car. So you can have one car plus a cargo bike. For older people, you know, if it provides a solution if you've got to carry luggage as well. It's not cheap, so you know, and I thought that was worth just highlighting as well. So the cargo bikes typically are pushing up towards around £5,000. It's definitely a considered purchase, but is also a more viable alternative to a car than the ones over to the left, which are not so well adapted to carrying luggage. So that's those are some alternatives to conventional bicycles and to walking to fill out the sort of active travel and micromobility ecosystem. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll talk just very quickly about where we are in terms of the law. Electric scooters, I thought it was really interesting listening to Ian and his piece. Electric scooters, you don't get the same physiological benefits, direct physiological benefits as you do from riding a bicycle. It doesn't raise your heart rate as much. There is undoubtedly a mental health and a well-being benefit from riding an electric scooter because they, as I say, they are a lot of fun and they get you out of doors and they get you moving around. And if it's a solution that enables somebody to visit friends or to socialize or to move around, if they're not confident riding a bicycle, then an electric scooter can provide a really good alternative. Currently, only legal to ride on private land with the landowner's permission. We've got the government now running trials, rolling them out across the country. There's a couple of up and running already and more to come. So they're looking at how they can bring electric scooters to change the primary legislation, the Road Traffic Act and the Highways Act, to make electric scooters legal. They've, for the purposes of the trials, they've imposed a power output limit of 500 watts and a speed limit. You do require a provisional driving license to participate in the scooter trials, though some kids in Teesside already seem to have been challenging that principle and having some fun on it. And I think that is going to be an interesting challenge. Everybody has agreed electric scooters should not be on pavements, and the RNIB, amongst others, are extremely concerned about the risks that they pose to disabled people, partially sighted people, particularly if you've got rental scooters parked on pavements. They then become a trip hazard. So there are some issues for the government to work through there, but hopefully they're going to find a way through to make electric scooters legal. Electric bikes, by contrast, are illegal, technically electrically assisted pedal cycles. So if you don't pedal, they don't work. Unlike the beast that Simon Cowell fell off recently, which was, to all intents and purposes, a motorcycle that just happened to have an electric motor and could do, I think, up to about 60 miles an hour. With an electric bicycle, you have to pedal to make the motor work, and the motor cuts out at 15.5 miles an hour. If you've never ridden an electric bike, I would encourage you to try it. And I speak as an enthusiastic cyclist. I like riding my bicycle. Getting on an electric bike is still a whole lot of fun. And the feeling you get when you hit a hill and the motor kicks in and all of a sudden you feel like you've got the legs of Chris Froome, it is quite fantastic. And I think for a lot of people, they provide a really, really useful bridge for people who don't want to get hot and sweaty, who are worried about the effort of riding up hills, who are worried about the distances involved. Electric bikes are a fantastic solution. Power output capped at 250 watts, maximum speed 15.5 miles an hour, and you do have to be 14 years old to ride one. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to dwell on this. I'm sorry, it's a bit of a sort of cardiac arrest of a chart, but I think it's worth just highlighting what's been happening with travel in the last few months. The Department for Transport is very helpfully publishing this data on a weekly basis. And that huge spike along the top is what happened to cycling. They took the 1st of March as a baseline as 100%. And then you can see as we went through April and May, there was a huge increase in the use of cycling as a mode of transport. It reached nearly 400% of pre-COVID levels of transport activity. As you can also see, as we come through the summer, through into July and August, cycling is steadily diminishing. And by contrast, the lines, the orange, the red and the gray across the middle are motor transport. You've got cars, light vehicles, heavy goods vehicles. They are already now back to 100% of what they were pre-COVID. We've got around 8.9 million school children about to go back to school, something for which I think a lot of their parents will be quite grateful, and about 9.5 million workers coming off furlough in the next couple of months. Currently, those lines across the bottom, the green and the brown and the dark blue, that's public transport usage, and it's still now only at around 50% of pre-COVID levels. So my anxiety around the situation we're in now is that first of all, there appears to be some reluctance to resume the use of public transport, and a lot of buses and trains are running at 50% capacity. They won't let you use all the seats on the vehicles for social distancing reasons. It's unclear at the moment what is going to happen as we go through September and October, and whether they're going to find ways to expand their capacity, whether people are going to be willing to use public transport, whether we're going to see an increase in cycling, bearing in mind we're heading into poorer weather, or whether in fact we're actually now going to see an increase in car usage. And I think that's the big worry, is that thinking about some of the stuff Ian was talking about earlier on, about habit forming and the opportunities you get to change people's habits. I think the risk right now is that, having had that wonderful cycling dividend as we went through the summer, we may already be in danger of losing it. Next slide, please. So I won't dwell on this. Look, cycling's good. We've covered this ground already. So let's move on to the next slide. And I thought it was worth just highlighting this one. So we know cycling's good. This was a study done on 100 adults aged 50 to 83, control group, some on conventional pedal cycles, some on e-bikes. Both cycling groups improved cognitive function performance compared to the control group. They used things like the Stroop test, which I'm sure Ian is familiar with, where you do nasty things like you write the word blue, but you do it in red, and you test people's ability just to kind of distinguish what's going on there. I mean, good fun stuff like that, and they could identify that whether people were on electric bikes or conventional bicycles, the simple act of cycling improved their cognitive function, improved their mental health, and in some cases, the benefits of the e-bike were better than a conventional pedal cycle. And again, coming back to the point, if you've tried riding an electric bike, you will be aware it does raise your heart rate, it does exercise your muscles, but in a much more controlled way than tends to be the case for a conventional pedal cycle. Next slide, please. I just wanted to highlight something that I know Ian contributed to, which was a Shimano report on electric bikes. Currently, you can read the data there for yourselves. The percentage likely to buy or use an e-bike more now than 12 months ago. The UK lags well behind the rest of Europe. The main reasons for riding an electric bike were to increase the distance, to improve health, and because it's less effort. The main thing putting people off riding an electric bicycle is the cost, and as we've seen already, they're not cheap. And there is undoubtedly, for a lot of people, particularly if you're on a state pension, there's a cost issue there. Some don't like cycling, some don't feel safe. I think culturally, whether you're talking about electric bikes or conventional bicycles, we've still got some big barriers to get over in getting people around to the idea that it is safe to cycle, that it is good to cycle, and that it is okay to ride a bicycle. Next slide, please. Okay, I just wanted to quickly highlight this. I'm sorry, there's lots of bullet points and lots of type, and there were some lovely pictures in the earlier presentation, so I now feel bad about that. DFT Transport Attitude Survey. Most people are aware of scooters, most people are aware of electric bikes, most people know very little about them. And coming down to the bottom bullet points on both sides, only around 5% of people had used either an electric scooter or an electric bicycle, and hardly anyone is using them regularly. Now, current sales of these kinds of transport currently in the UK are around 10% of what we see in a lot of European countries. So, I mean, the good news is there's a lot more that we can do. The bad news is we're not currently doing it, and I think in a lot of respects we're around 10 years behind a lot of our counterparts. Next slide, please. So what can the government do about it? Can we build this slide up, please? And it's probably easier, just throw it all on there and then we'll talk about it afterwards. Keep going. There we go. That's it. Brilliant. Thank you. So what we'd like to see the government doing, certainly accelerate the scooter trials. I think in the context of the economic challenge and the transport challenge that we face today, the current government trajectory of evaluating the scooter trials over the next 12 months, then deciding even whether, let alone how, they're going to legalize scooters seems crazy. They should move much faster than that. They should make it clear now that they will make scooters legal, and they should start working on the primary legislation. And they should look to bring electric scooters into the Cycle to Work scheme. On the electric cycle stuff, The gear change vision, that document up top right, there's a lot of really good stuff in there. The government's talking a really good game on cycling, on active travel generally. Things like changing the cost-benefit analysis equation that they use for transport infrastructure. That's critical. If you start looking at a road junction, not in terms of how many cars you can squeeze through it, but how you can accommodate things like bicycles, how you can get people walking through junctions, it changes the whole design of the junction. They're introducing this new body, Active Travel England, specifically to oversee how local authorities do implement changes to their infrastructure. They're looking at this idea of mini Hollands, of low traffic neighborhoods. All that kind of stuff is really, really important. They talked briefly about grants for e-bikes, and without putting any detail into that, but right down to little things like putting safe parking, so that if you do ride your bicycle into town, there's somewhere you can park it easily when you want to go to the shops, and know that your bicycle will still be there when you come back again half an hour later. Living in Bristol, I can tell you that bicycle theft is a real issue, and if you've just spent a chunky sum of money on a bicycle, the last thing you want is for someone to come along and nick it. So the government's talking a good game at the moment. I think it's down to a lot of it comes down in the end to local people like Suzanne and local councils to implement these, particularly the low traffic neighborhoods, and just the simple things like blocking off roads so you don't get rat runs coming through, so you push through traffic around the side of neighborhoods. That will make an enormous difference. But talking to a local councillor in Bristol yesterday, they actually run a grant scheme to help people access electric bikes, and they're not being taken up. So I think it's also partly about publicising it. Next slide, please. Okay, so I just briefly wanted to touch finally on Cycle to Work, which I imagine some of you are already familiar with, but essentially it just involves your employer. You select a bicycle, your employer buys it, you hire it from your employer. The costs are coming out of your gross pay. So you save typically between about 30 and 40% of the cost of the bicycle. You make stage payments over a number of months, and at the end of the term, you get to keep the bike. Now that's great, but it depends on you having an employer. So next slide, please. One of the things I'd like to see the government adopt is the idea of a cycle to retirement, to introduce a cycle to work scheme for retired people. We know, particularly single pensioners, typically don't have a lot of spare money. Now, the state pension comes out gross, but you can make adjustments through the tax code. State pension on average makes up 57% of single pensioners' gross incomes, and incomes decline with age. The government knows that people vote. They're talking and this government is heavily dependent upon older voters. So we know we're talking to their constituency. I think it would be a fantastic thing if this government were to introduce a cycle to retirement scheme so that older people could access bicycles, electric bicycles, tax-free, make it easier. We know that cost is a barrier to cycling, so I just think that'd be a really good, simple change they could introduce. And I think that was the last of my slides. Let's just see if we can go any further. Yep, that was me done, so I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Cycle to retirement is a really interesting idea. Of course, as we get older, actually, we'll also have a higher proportion of people who are self-employed, so may well not find it more difficult to benefit from an employee scheme. So maybe there's something about that group. I think the point about demand is really interesting, and I suspect demand for your sorts of solutions, the micromobility, is going to increase, although clearly one of the challenges we have with things like e-bikes is if a perception grows that this is for older people, that the risk is that this puts off older people and younger people. So actually it's a very difficult thing as to how you market it. I've always, one of the things that we do spend a lot of time doing in think tanks is writing proposals, and we have far more of them than we ever end up getting funding. But one of the things that we've always wanted to, I've always wanted to do was a piece of work where we asked children what they would be buying their parents for Christmas or grandparents for Christmas, and then go and ask the parents or grandparents themselves what they would like, and then throwing these together. And my sense actually is that micromobility with a bit of qualitative work would be a hugely popular amongst older people. I remember my my grandfather in his 80s wanting a bike and being told by the family he was too old and he shouldn't, and actually there was a bit of overprotecting of older people we might want to come back to as well, but actually people want to get around, and if you're not driving, and I think one of the things we know from, and I think it was Charlie Musselwhite who Ian mentioned before, his work showed that if you say to older people, do you want an autonomous vehicle, people tend to say no, why the hell would I want that? If instead you give someone a play on it and then let them go, this is bloody brilliant. Everyone should, and I suspect the same is the case with things, some of these solutions, even scooters. I can see a group of older people wanting to charge down the road on scooters, and I don't think it's necessarily just your mammal effect. I don't think we need to talk. We're going to move on to questions. My colleague has been putting some of the questions that people asked before into the Q&A. Please do upvote those or add your own questions. So you can upvote them by putting I think there's a little heart, and that allows us to see the most popular ones. Don't think we actually particularly need to talk about the health benefits. I think that's pretty clear, going back to, and I was reminded by one of the presentations of Jerry Morris. And for those of you who don't know that Jerry Morris, he was an epidemiologist, I think, who was the guy who first really discovered the link between sort of, you know, activity and health. And he did this really interesting study that compared I think it was the heart attack rates of bus drivers with bus conductors in London, and found that actually huge difference, because of course the bus conductors were going up and down the stairs all day and the bus drivers were just sitting there. So we know that there is a health benefit. I'm going to perhaps sort of, you know, move to questions, and I'm going to kick off with one that I think that I see from, that came in early from Tom Addison, who talked about, so in my local area, one of the councils has pedestrianised some towns near the high street, some of the areas near the high street. Can this work in isolation, or does it need other policies? And I picked this one initially because there was a really interesting academic project 5 or 6 years ago called I'd Go, and then I'd Go 2, that was about the built environment and how, you know, it explored the extent to which changing the built environment impacted upon walking behavior. And when they did their analysis at the end, one of the things they found was that it took a really long time to change behavior, and the reason being that existing older people who lived half a mile away from the town didn't actually know that the walking route had changed, so they continued to drive. They had no, whereas when new older people moved into the town, the first thing they did was walk into the town, think this is fine, this is a lovely way of doing it. So it almost took a generation for the impact to happen. So and maybe let me pick on Susan from a planning point of view. You know, clearly, you know, the pedestrianization, the sort of design, you know, my sense from, you know, Twitter cycling, not that that's the, you know, clearly representative of the world, is that it's all about infrastructure. Do we think that's true?
No, I mean, I think it can help, and the particular question about pedestrianisation, I think, can help a high street. It will depend on the nature of that high street, and in some places, I think for me, it's more about reducing car dominance. And if you take all cars out of a high street, that can mean some shopping streets can feel quite isolated, particularly in the evenings, if there's no one actually using it, and they almost become sort of more like ghettos, very empty and vacant. So it will depend on the high street. So I think the starting point is really reducing car dominance, which will mean taking out some parking spaces, which will reduce the volume of traffic, putting in parklets, making sure there are benches, all of these things that make the high street a more human place. So in some cases, if it's a really busy shopping street, then it maybe it's pedestrianisation, but I think that's not the answer. And I think a lot of this is around language as well, because when people talk about pedestrianisation, they sort of see it as an all or nothing and they fear change. Whereas I said, if you can do something gradually by reducing the car dominance, then it's not such an all or nothing situation. So I think it can help, and I think it will be then enhanced if we have things like the low traffic neighbourhoods to cut out the through traffic. So it's one of those things that can have merit in its own right, but become even more powerful when it's part of a wider strategy for transport. But I said it also, you know, other things like the public toilets. So it has to be seen in its entirety.
Thanks, Susan. Anyone of the other speakers like to come in on pedestrianisation?
I
Suzanne?
think just to add, I think just to add, because we've had some recent experiences of this within the COVID recovery scheme, essentially funded through the High Street recovery. And I have to say, in a small market town such as the one I represent, which is Witney in Oxfordshire, around 30,000 residents, we have gone ahead and had what I call an opening of the High Street, but obviously the signage says a closure, which I think is important, the communication around what this actually is and what it means. It's been an interesting learning experience. So, for example, initially there was some negativity because we had a lot of barriers which were not particularly inviting. There were, in fact, they blew over in the wind, and there were all sorts of difficulties. It was implemented very quickly for obvious reasons, and I think that did have some benefits in terms of that there obviously wasn't a protracted consultation. We went ahead and it happened. But at the same time, I totally agree about that. Behaviour change takes much longer. It's not going to happen within weeks. The other difficulty has been that there's been concern about the impact upon retail, but obviously that's very much in the context of COVID impacts and recovery anyway. So it's very difficult to unpick that. However, I think moving forwards, it does give a sense of what that area could be like. And I agree again with what Susan said, it's placing people at the centre rather than having the car dominance. And some of the feedback has been, well, this is too empty, we need to have something else. So I agree that I think a package is better than a single measure in its own right.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Suzanne. Ian, from your experience from Bath, do you think, how did people talk about pedestrianisation, and did they see it as being a good thing?
The city centre is probably not a bad example of what Susan and Suzanne have just described, actually, that it is very, well, relatively easy to get around on foot. It's pleasant, but there are still the occasional vehicle passing through, and especially at night you get slightly more coming through. But I'd say the centre of the city was maybe 75% towards a really good version of a city that puts the person first in the way that we've just heard described. Actually, in Bath, where the real debate has been happening, has been in some of the slightly the areas on the edge of the city where we've been to decide
Hi, I think we may have lost some sound there. I think if you can still hear me, I'm hoping. Yeah, good. I think I thought that was my internet, but I think it might have been Ian, so sorry about that. I was panicking for a moment, but I can blame Ian instead. I'm sure Ian will connect back in with us in a second. Let's Tom, have you got anything you want to add in terms of that, or in terms of pedestrianisation? Or
Just quickly then, I think it's really interesting what we're seeing in Bristol at the moment, where we've closed one of the main bridges in the city centre, and one of the main access roads, and it's been pedestrianised. Currently, there are still cars going across it. The council currently is using number plate recognition technology to send polite letters to those car drivers, pointing out to them that the bridge is now only open to bus drivers. In about a week, they're going to start finding them, and that might see a significant reduction in the amount of cars going across. Then, one other observation on that: one of the reasons they did that was because of an Extinction Rebellion demonstration that took place in Bristol city centre last summer, and on the strength of that, the council realised that closing that bridge didn't have to be a problem from a traffic point of view, that you could work around it. So I think it's quite, I'm not sure if Extinction Rebellion know that, but it took them a while, but it's had an effect. And I think there's a lot of good plans going on in Bristol city centre. I think it is all currently, it was interesting listening to Suzanne, it's quite fragmented, it's happening quite quickly. But you know, I think just keeping the forward momentum going, you know, we've got a local cycling and walking infrastructure plan, so to just trying to implement it wherever you can, I think is the way forward. But it's going to take a while. This is not going to be quick stuff. I mean, certainly in Bristol, I can tell you it's going to take a while to properly change people's habits. Finding the next week might be a good place to start.
Thanks, thanks, Tom. And Ian, we lost you there, but I'm glad we have you. Back. I'm just going to move on to sort of in a few of the presentations, and it's just come up, I think, in one of the questions as well. There's been a point about sort of, you know, the evening and people being a bit worried in the evening to get out and about. And what we know is that you know, in the winter, for example, there are people who don't leave the home from 4 o'clock, you know, in the afternoon, and will stay in until the following morning. The other, you know, and yes, again, another of those projects we've never ever managed to get funding, but I think is really interesting and really important, I think, for many local authorities, is a real recognition of the importance of the nighttime economy and the role of older people in it. And I think, yeah, you know, I've talked to lots of local authorities about sort of nighttime economy, and they're all like, what do you mean older people? You know, and one of the things that's really striking is that we know older people spend a huge amount of money, have a huge amount of resource, but actually most nighttime economy strategies entirely ignore older people. And clearly, as part of those strategies, we need to be thinking about how we can get people to and from the centre safely. But my sense is they're not on the agenda yet. And I mentioned it partly because it links into Ian's point. There was some research from Westminster 5 or 6 years, no, maybe longer, maybe 10 years ago, from Westminster University, that looked at how accessible bus stops were to people in towns, villages, city, for 4 or 5 different environments. And one of the things it found was that in all sorts of towns, cities, and in lots of environments, the bus stop was actually only accessible for people about 200 or 300 meters away from the bus stop when they got into old age. And the reason being exactly the sort of things that you said, that actually people were, you know, didn't like walking in the dark, there was no bus shelter, it was too hilly, as we've seen in Bath. But actually you had this really interesting bus service that actually in theory served tens of thousands of people, 1,000 people, but actually only in reality served about 40 people, because no one would go there and sit there because there was no bus shelter or fear of crime. So a very, very long sort of rant really, but actually around sort of, you know, I wonder if people have got observations around what we could do around sort of the nighttime issue, and, you know, how do we engage sort of the broader local authority in terms of fear of crime and things like that. So, Suzanne, are you doing things like that in Oxford?
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo your thoughts exactly there. Certainly, I think it is a sector that's really overlooked, particularly in the economic context of the nighttime economy, which very much focuses upon the younger age group. I think that taxis are particularly important there as well. So I know that our local taxi services are particularly concerned about the downturn in the nighttime economy, but again, it's very much focused upon younger people as opposed to the older age group. And just picking up on your point really about the bus stops, which has been something of a campaigning focus of myself, partly because my grandmother said to me she'd stopped taking the bus because she couldn't sit down at the bus stop, and it's something that's just so simple, a seat at the local bus stop. It's all very well having a bus service, and yes, we did lose a lot in Oxfordshire, but we have reasonable good coverage on the major routes. But just as you said, actually, if you can't access the bus stop and if you can't sit down at the bus stop, and if you have no shelter at the bus stop, then it's no point having the service itself. So inconsistency is a major problem with that. I'd like to see a set standard that has to be met, particularly across our rural bus stops, because to be quite honest, they're in a pretty appalling state at the moment.
Thanks, Suzanne. Ian, you mentioned it as a particular problem, the sort of the getting out at night and that fear. Did you identify any solutions, or did anyone sort of say, wouldn't it be nice if?
Yeah, no, actually, because I was kind of shocked by what we got in those interviews. Now, obviously, it was only 20, 30 interviews or something like that. So it's definitely not a slice of everybody in the country. But yeah, people seemed, from what I could gather, quite resigned in a not a very pleasant way to, nope, I'm at a point in life where I just can't go out at night. And that felt really terrible to read, and really made me feel that we've got to do something about this.
Thanks, Ian. Susan, are the things that planners can do, are the things that I'm going to run the risk of misrepresenting research, which I frequently do, but I remember we've done some work with UCL in the past, and they're actually the engineering team over there, and one of the things that they've done quite a lot of work on is the design of lighting. And one thing I remember them saying to me, and this was a long time ago, so it may have changed, is that a lot of street lighting was designed to basically make roads look smooth, and as opposed to create the right sort of lighting for pedestrians. So the question is that true? But actually, because I think they were doing some work looking at whether you could redesign lighting in such a way that it made the pedestrian environment better, but whilst also reflecting the sort of different needs of different users.
Yeah, I think there are a number of things that can be done. And for me, I think the first thing is actually thinking of hours of darkness and not nighttime, because we're in a situation, sadly, in the winter where it's dark from 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So if you've got people who aren't going out during hours of darkness, that means really they're only going out from sort of 8 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon during the winter. So it isn't a nighttime thing, it's a darkness thing. And yes, lighting, I think, can help a lot. There are some mixed views. If places are too bright, people feel unsafe. So a lot of this is about perception. But I think overall, I mean, the important thing is that if you have people out walking and cycling on the streets, it makes it safer for other people to walk and cycle. Now, that doesn't mean that someone who is not currently going out will start going out because they don't know that street's like that, but it might mean that they carry on using it. But there are sort of buddying projects where if people want to go out for a walk when it's dark, they could be buddied up with somebody else. And again, I think through having low traffic neighborhoods, having more social interaction with neighbors, there can be that neighborly support. And I think particularly the thing about bus stops is having a bench maybe en route to a bus stop, and that's why I think having benches on residential streets where there is space is a really important thing to do. You then get the counter argument, well, it will encourage loitering, which is always an interesting one, because loitering, it seems to be who is loitering. If it's a teenager in a hoodie, it's bad. If it's a 60-year-old lady, that's good. So it depends on who is loitering. But I think actually having more seating areas, having more benches, and as you've probably picked up, I'm a massive fan of parklets, taking out some parking spaces on residential streets and turning them into a community facility where there is planting, where there is someone to rest. Again, it means someone can break up the journey, and you can put those parklets in associated with bus stops or with tram stops as well. So I know in Melbourne at the moment they're doing tram stop parklets. So wherever you have a tram stop, they're creating a parklet to create a nicer waiting area when you're waiting for the bus. So you do have that seating. So I think there are lots of things that can be, but I think probably the most fundamental is seeing it from, you know, the insider's viewpoint and understanding why people aren't going out in hours of darkness, and then seeing what can be done. Some of these small changes talked about, and I said this is where, you know, if council members have small budgets for small pieces of work, that can make really big changes. So things can be done. It's important to work with the community and do this as a sort of bottom up to understand what's stopping people from going out.
Thanks, Susan. Eileen's asked a question about the cost issue. A barrier to walking to cycling for people who are disabled is the cost of equipment. I was really interested in Tom's idea. Do others have ideas of ways in which we could address the cost barrier? How much do you see cost as being a big issue in this space? Is it a real issue? How can we overcome it? Any thoughts on that? I'm going to pick on someone. Ian, let me pick on you.
I can't answer that question, but I just wanted to make a comment about the kind of cultural side of this. That there are a lot of people who are, for one reason or another, essentially trapped having to drive, and especially as we look in rural areas. And we can debate the rights and wrongs of it, but there are a lot of people who are de facto in a kind of car dependency, and we never discuss whether people can afford a car. It's maybe just creeping into some recent discussions about urban life, but why do we only have this discussion when it comes to buying a bike?
Great, no, really interesting point. Does anyone else want to come in on cost and anything? Yeah, Susan. Yeah.
I think particularly when it comes to cycling, I think it's, having, it doesn't necessarily have to be ownership, it's having access. And that's the important thing, because, again, if we look at cars, lots of data to show we use cars, for 4% of the time, 96% of the time they're parked. And actual individual ownership of a lot of these things are not necessary. So it could be, and we're starting to see this with some of the cycle hire schemes. And I think in the future, if they go from bike hire schemes to cycle hire schemes, and we have more diversity of cycles that are available through hires, and also just to help people try something, because it's an enormous leap to go out and spend a lot of money on something you haven't fully tried. Whereas if you can get familiar with it or have some experience through a cycle hire scheme, then you can actually decide whether it is the right thing for you or not, and that de-risks it. So I think the whole shared ownership side of it is really important.
And just to add one small thing to that, there's a lot of interest at the moment in the idea of mobility as a service, and that would very much fit with what Susan just said, because that potentially broadens it out. Today I'll take an e-scooter, tomorrow I'll take a taxi.
Yeah, no, absolutely, really interesting. I know there've been ideas in the past around things like, if you have if you buy your travel card in London, you should be able to use it on the bikes as well, for example. And I guess with integrated transport, you could find ways of doing things like that, which would be, really interesting. Anyone else? Tom, are you doing piloting or trialing to get people to whet their appetite in this?
So we're still looking at ways we can land that cycling to retirement idea. We're talking to Bristol City Council about what we can do to give people the opportunity to try e-bikes. So yes, absolutely. And I think, interestingly, they have a grant scheme, but it's not been heavily taken up. So there's just a simple promotion challenge there, just to encourage people to make use of them. And I think the point's already been made. If you can find ways to allow people to try stuff out at a low cost, where they're not having to buy equipment, where they can just borrow or rent equipment, try stuff out for a month or whatever. Then you give them the opportunity to make an informed decision about how they might want to move forward from there. And I think that's a challenge for businesses like ours, and for people like Suzanne, for local councillors, to try and work together to find solutions to implement collaboratively.
Thanks, Tom. I think the point Ian made at the start is really interesting in terms of generally in terms of perceptions around cost, and active travel. And I probably I don't know if Pedal Me will thank me or not for this, but for those of you who don't know, Pedal Me is a cycle logistics company in London that's been growing significantly, and you can actually get on one and ride a Pedal Me bike. You can basically be pushed around on a bike instead of bit cycling, but equally they move stuff. And so Pedal Me moved the entire ILC office in under 2 hours, and it cost us less than £75. We would not have managed that with a van. It would have cost us huge amounts more, and actually the van wouldn't have had anywhere to park at either end. So there is, I think actually some of these solutions are much cheaper potentially than the alternative at the moment. Lots of other questions in here. I'm going to ask everyone except Tom, because Tom's already talked about. Tell me about the rest of the panel. So starting with Ian, your perception around sort of the role and potential of e-bikes. As a cyclist, yourself, to what extent do they have a role to play, and how can we support e-bikes within the sort of broader environment of this debate?
Oh, well, I kind of wish I'd talked about this instead of walking now, because we did a project on it just this last year. So we were doing this experimental thing at the university called Vertically Integrated Projects, which is kind of self-organized groups of students working on a practical problem with an academic mentor. So I was the academic overseer for a group. And it was a deliberately mixed group of students with engineers and social scientists and health researchers and so on. And when they had to find, so the first thing of interest, when that diverse group of students had to find a topic that they all found interesting, e-bikes is what they settled on. So that in itself tells you something kind of interesting, that the health and the engineers were happy to work on e-bikes together. And what we ended up doing was a really nice analysis for the county of Bath and North East Somerset as a trial, and working at LSOA level, which is the little sort of subunits of a city that Suzanne will be very, very familiar with. We used the propensity for cycling tool to estimate where you would get the most bang for the buck if you invested in supporting e-bikes. And there were two really interesting things that came out. The first was that it probably wasn't where you expected. So what we saw for Bath and North East Somerset was the maximal benefits in terms of population health, pollution reduction and congestion reduction were not in the city at all. They were in the outlying dormitory towns, which I didn't expect, but it was very, very clear when it came up in the numerical analysis. And the other thing that was really interesting is we then did a kind of equality analysis. So we said, okay, well, now we've got a rank order league table of all the LSOAs ordered by how much they would benefit from investment in e-bike support. But would that be unfair? Would that disproportionately help the richer, whiter, healthier wards? And actually what we found was it was an emphatic no. There was no relationship whatsoever between the rank order of where e-bike investment would be useful and who would benefit from it. It wouldn't be the wealthier, whiter, healthier wards at all who would most benefit. So I'm happy to share this report with anyone who wants it, because it's a nice little bit of reading. But it's Tom, no problem. But yeah, it's emphatically suggested that you could do e-bikes. It would make substantial difference to a city or a county, and that the impact might not be where you think. So you need to cast a slightly broader net.
Thanks. Suzanne, have you looked at this in terms of Oxford and Oxfordshire?
Yeah, so we're fortunate to have had the Cycle Boom project led at Oxford Brookes University, led by Ben Spencer and colleagues, which obviously demonstrated those benefits, lending out e-bikes to people aged over 50, and found that they cycle further and have greater mental health benefits compared to your ordinary pedal bike. So I think that we're lucky to have that, and I have to say that resonated with the decision makers at the county council. And we did actually have a series of councillors who were lent an e-bike, including myself, are very fortunate to have one for a week to go out and about. So I can speak for myself in terms of that buzz that one gets from the e-bikes. And it was great to have some of our other councillors try them out who wouldn't normally ride a bike at all. So I think that is I think that does have a role to play. I'd say that it's still bedding in with our decision makers still feel like I wouldn't say they necessarily fully understand e-bikes and about the infrastructure. For example, we've talked about whether we could have fleets that are new park and ride sites, because we're looking at extending park and ride outside of Oxford City, for example, and also those sort of docked e-bikes in market town areas as well. And again, echoing what Ian said in terms of propensity for cycling, yes, absolutely, from the Oxfordshire data, that is very much those key transport corridors to the city from the surrounding areas. And I think that's where this tremendous potential is for e-bikes. I'd like to see something really bold in terms of the grants for e-bikes and trade-in of cars for an e-bike. I think that is where there's huge potential there, and I think we've really got to grab that from a policy perspective.
Thanks, Suzanne. I think really important. You talked on infrastructure, so I'm going to bring Susan in. It's worth reflecting. I slightly, but I managed to have the opportunity last year of I was given this sort of behind-the-scenes tour of a theme park in a small bit of Germany, but it's Europe's biggest theme park, I think, called Europa Park. And they took me around the back, and I saw, and it's in this small town, and you go around the back, and they have, of course, this car park, and then they have a bike park with thousands of bikes. But what they also had was probably 40, 50, 60 points at which you could plug an e-bike in for staff. So because all the staff, or vast majority of staff, cycled over there from the town into there, but they had facilities. I think employers are a long way from having that sort of infrastructure. But what do we need to do, Susan? You had your hand up.
Yeah, I've never tried one, but I wanted to make a couple of points. I think firstly we need to think about e-cycles, not e-bikes. So it isn't. We need to get away from this two-wheel bicycle and be more inclusive. But I think for me, and I talked previously about the importance of sharing schemes, and we don't have to necessarily own this, it's access to them, but there needs to be some docking or geofencing or something, because the way the variety of e-cycles get left on the footway is chaos and a real tripping hazard. And I've seen that in London, where we've had 3 different operators of e-cycles, probably more than that now, and they just get left all over the place. I've seen instances where they sort of get parked at 90 degrees to the highway, so they're completely blocking the footway. So I think the main thing has to be, and Hackney's started, I know now, taking out parking spaces to create cycle hire parking spaces. So I'm very much in support. I think they offer a lot of potential. I think they can assist with inclusive cycling. Again, people need to be given the confidence to try them, because they might need some training on how to use them, particularly if people are vulnerable, haven't cycled for a long time. But I think actually it comes down to the management of the system and making sure that they're not just left all over the place to be an inconvenience to other people.
Thanks, Susan. That's great. As I mentioned earlier on, ILC UK, we are one of 16, so we do quite a bit of international work with our colleagues. And I remember when we did a piece of work on transport 5 or 6 years ago, there was one of the things we came across was that in the 1960s, places like the Netherlands had very similar rates of cycling by older people as the UK, but actually over the last 40, 50 years, it's basically dropped dramatically in the UK, but remained relative and increased in the Netherlands. Just sort of leading me into sort of, in terms of older people, old age, active travel, walking, particularly cycling, is there anywhere internationally that we think does this really, really well? And who wants to? Ian, you've just done your big trip. What was the best country for facilities, do you think?
I'm possibly the wrong person to ask, because I was cycling on the fastest roads I could find, including a stretch of motorway in Latvia that you're allowed to cycle on. So yeah, I mean, probably the best one I've cycled on personally has to be the Netherlands. I'm sorry to be boring with that answer, but the Netherlands was a great example of how nice it is when the barriers are just taken away from you, when your journey is perceived as important and facilitated. So, for example, as you ride along a cycle path, sensors that detect you're approaching a junction stop the cars and let you whiz across. And it, you know, coming from Britain, just to have an environment where your needs are anticipated and pointless barriers are removed was revelatory.
Thanks, Ian. Suzanne, you know, how do we get the Netherlands sort of, you know, can we make Oxford like the Netherlands in this space?
I do hope so. Yeah, I was very fortunate to spend a week in Utrecht last year, and actually I'm really keen that we are able to send our transport planners over there as well to learn about the built environment, because I think, again, it's this sense of being valued as a vulnerable road user, as Ian said, rather than feeling like you're in a hostile environment having to fight for space. There you very much feel as though you do have the right to be there, you do have the right to be on a bike, and in fact, you know, you actually genuinely have priority, as you said, and it is designed around the needs of those vulnerable road users. So I think that, yes, but it did take time, and I think this is the other element, is that we often get the counter argument, well, we're not as flat as the Netherlands, or we've got a car industry, or, you know, we don't have the same topography and geography. And I think that I spent a lot of my time trying to counter those arguments. And actually, I think fundamentally the point is that the Netherlands had these real challenges at the start, and it did take a number of decades to get to where they are now. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's not something that's going to happen with this single government strategy. It's something which we really need to commit to over a long period of time if we genuinely are going to reverse the hierarchy of road users and the whole built environment as well.
Thanks. Susan, do you want to come in?
Yeah, well, one of my favourite examples is the town of Pontevedra in northwest Spain, which is particularly good for walking. And I like to use that as an example because it's a town of 80,000 people. You know, it isn't a London or a Milan or a New York or a Paris that people will say is not relevant to their own place. So it's a relatively small place. Picking up Suzanne's point, it does take time, but they've had a strategy for the last 20 years to reduce car dominance. So it has an old walled centre. Cars are still allowed in, but under very restricted conditions, and the cars are very much the guest, if you like. They travel very slowly, they've got very little space, and the area is a really good one for walking around. There are lots of benches, there are public toilets, as I mentioned. I think that's a really important part of the urban infrastructure, and it is really about this reducing vehicle dominance, and that is, I think, is the most important thing to encourage walking and to encourage cycling as well. And I said that can be done, you know, by reducing speeds, by reducing parking, by having forms of national road pricing, so people are not using cars so much. So it isn't a question of getting rid of all cars, but it's certainly reducing the dominance of them. But Pontevedra is a lovely example. What they've found there is that children as young as 7 will walk to school, because they've also got a system whereby if any children are unsure about things, they go into a local shop, and the shopkeeper is there, and they know to do that. And what they've also found is that the population has gone up, whereas the other towns in the same region, the population has declined. So it really shows how people want to live in a place like that, and a strong economic benefit. So it's a really lovely example. Also agree with Utrecht, love all the Miffy. Grew up with Miffy, so the fact they have Miffy on the pedestrian crossings is fabulous. But there are some really good examples, and that's the thing. None of this stuff is that fancy. You know, none of it is the rocket science or whatever. We know what to do. We know how to do it. It comes down to the politics of actually getting it done. And I said, I'm seeing this all the time with the low traffic neighborhoods. I mean, low traffic neighborhoods to me make the ultimate sense, because all you're doing is taking out through traffic, creating safer streets for everybody to walk and cycle. And I think particularly a benefit for older people. But I've seen it in my own area, the hostile comments, and about how disabled people are going to be prisoners in their own home, and people aren't going to be able to get access, and roads being closed. And, given everything that's happening this year, the fact that some people are most concerned about low traffic neighborhoods, that's what they're taking to the streets to march against. I just find it incredible. And I think it's one of those things that if it happens, it will be what was all the fuss about. So yeah, reduce car dominance.
Thanks, Susan. And I think the one of the things that's always striking to me in terms of both of those points is that grandparents and grandchildren spend huge amounts of money to go to centre parks where there are no cars, and actually but yet when we're at home, because we think we might need to skip once every 8 years, for some reason we just decide we need this huge amount of space in front of all of our houses. Tom.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on the points made about the Netherlands. It's important to remember they didn't set off in this direction, post-war, go back to the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. They were heading in the same direction as us. It was built around the cars and the highways, and they made a conscious national decision that we don't like where we're going with this. And it took a long time to then change that trajectory, but it was a very conscious decision to move away from, if they hadn't done that, they'd be where we are now. And that's what they were building after the Second World War. So they changed that, and it took a long time, and then they ended up in the right place. And I think that then comes back to the political willingness and the political capital to deliver. And I come back to that gear change strategy document. All the right stuff is in there. Everything Susan's talked about. We know what the answers are. It's just now dependent upon the political will to see it through, and on stakeholders outside the political machine to keep the pressure on to make sure that they don't let up on that pace of change.
Thanks, Tom. I'm going to do 2 more questions, and I'm going to prepare the panel for the last one, which is the one that has been at the top since the start from Tony. What's your top public policy priorities? So, if possible, could you, our panel be prepared to finish on what needs to happen? What's your number one, or if we got a rule of 3, what's your rule of 3 that you want to that you think we should prioritize on? But just before I go on to that, do we think that sort of, whether it be in terms of the cycling industry or cycling, that but equally in terms of sort of walking, we're sort of a little bit too focused on youth as opposed to all ages? Is there more we can do? Is the tension between young and old real, in terms of the conflict for space, in terms of cycling and walking and attitudes towards cars? So a bit sort of general observations around sort of age and the sort of the extent to which we do have an issue here, a sort of elephant in the room that we do need to talk about. Does anyone want to go? Ian, do you want to come in there from a sort of academic point of view?
Yeah, I could probably do it longer to think, to be honest.
Let me give you a couple of seconds to draw a sort of slight anecdote, and it's cycling rather than walking again. I remember so I run a small cycling group, and before quite a few years ago, before CTC rebranded, we had someone come over and talk about their work, and one of their they spent almost half of the time talking about how they needed to get more younger people cycling. And one of the things that I couldn't really get my head around was actually the low-hanging fruit firstly is probably older, not younger people, but also that actually the CTC model is unique. It involves men going and typically men going and spending their whole Sundays doing an activity which is in this sort of and actually people that you sort of, lots of people don't have the time and actually have to spend time on a Sunday doing different things. And I just wonder if actually we're trying, I wonder if they were trying to reach a market where, given the nature of their product, it wasn't the right offer for that market anyway. And I wonder if actually the extent to which both cycling and walking, we really think enough about age and differences in what people might need and how they might want to engage with this. Susan.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that came out from particularly the Living Streets research that I mentioned about for older people was expectations. and you know, people were just accepting it as a part of the aging process, that you know, you wouldn't be able to do so much, and you know, it was just sort of their lot, and they shouldn't be out, they would, you know, it didn't occur to them to be out campaigning to actually have improved facilities, or to lobby their council member to have a bench on the way to the bus stop, or improve their paving. It was like, well, this is it was an acceptance. And I think that's why we need one of the differences, and I think between younger people and older people that you were mentioning, I think it is trying to actually say these things do matter. And the absolute important thing for me is the area of sort of the co-benefits or cross-sector benefits, which we've been, you know, I was working for the Department for Transport back in the 80s, and we were working on this then in terms of accessible buses. You know, if you give people the means to be independent, to be able to walk and cycle, to get to their local neighbourhoods, then it's going to save bills so much. You know, we know the numbers from the National Health Service in terms of the benefits of, you know, the savings from inactivity. You know, there are so many benefits, but they're not captured in the economic process. So the expenditure, it might be by the transport team, the benefits are felt elsewhere, and they don't get taken into the equation. So I think there needs to be more about that. And I said then, and I think there needs to be an increase in expectation that, you know, just because you're 70, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be walking or cycling or going out or doing things, or not going out in hours of darkness. You know, we want people to actually want to do these things.
Yeah, indeed, and as Tom started, you know, we all need to take risks actually as well. And clearly, I think there probably is some ageism in it. Anyone else want to come in on their age? And Suzanne?
Yeah, I think just from a medical perspective, really, that we have this tendency that you have to protect oneself as one ages, and protect oneself from hazards and from the wider environment. And I think that actually this comes back to the fact that it is healthy to be exercising. It is much healthier than to be indoors experiencing isolation as well, and it's part of training. It's part of retaining muscle strength into later life, and I think that is really important. I think the medical community has got a really important part to play there, I have to say, in terms of moving away from this sort of medicalization and protected nature of aging, really towards much more of a healthy aging focus and strategy, and also about giving this type of advice about what is good for one's health into later life, and what the benefits are as well, because I suspect that many are not really aware that actually all of these benefits outweigh the risks involved of these activities.
Great.
I'll just jump.
Well, yeah.
Do you mind if I just jump in? Because I'm going to sound like a real social scientist now, but I think both Susan and Suzanne's answers have been making me think of this thing I keep coming back to, which is that all of the behavior, all of the policy, it takes place within our culture, and our culture shapes these things. And I would say that fundamentally we have a few aspects of our culture that are just out of whack. And if I could wave a magic wand and fix one thing, it would be certain cultural assumptions. One of those assumptions is that streets are fundamentally for cars. Streets are fundamentally for driving down. And a lot of these other things become understandable when you realize that's what people are thinking subconsciously. So, for example, the acceptance of not being able to walk that Susan talked about because of bad infrastructure. Oh, well, guess I can't walk anymore. That's because we see walking as a bit of a luxury rather than the most fundamentally important use of a street. Similarly, you know, our culture just makes us afraid of certain things, not least bikes. We have a cultural fear of bicycles, I would argue, so that it's very common to hear people say things like, you know, oh, a bike whizzed past and barely missed me, as they stand on the edge of a pavement with cars whipping by 30 centimeters away from their knees, completely failing to notice that that's even happening constantly. So we've got to realize we have some very strange cultural blind spots. Again, one final one, we've talked today about, you know, how do we overcome the terrible barriers to, you know, the fear of getting on a bike and overcoming the knowledge gaps of how you ride a bike. Everybody cheerfully spends 5 months learning to drive a car and hundreds of pounds learning that skill, and we never worry about that. People just will happily spend time and money learning a very difficult skill of driving a car, and no one bats an eyelid, but we all expect vast amounts of help to learn to ride a bike because that's special and difficult and dangerous and crazy. And that's, again, our cultural blind spot.
Thanks, Ian. Really, really interesting. And of course, you know, in the same way, sort of actually accessing swimming lessons in adulthood is really difficult unless you want to do one-to-one. Actually, if you don't learn as a child how to ride a bike, it's actually remarkably difficult in many places to do it, to actually have that confidence and find somewhere where you can actually learn, not just learn the physical way of how you do it, but actually that some of the, you know, how you use the road. Okay, let me move on to the question I promised. So your top three policy recommendations. Let me start with Tom.
Okay, thank you, David. So I've talked about a couple of things already. I think the cycle to retirement idea would be a really interesting one for the government to actively promote access to cycling equipment for older people who don't have the cycle to work scheme. I think a car scrappage scheme, something Susan I think mentioned, and which I'm absolutely in favour of. You know, let's incentivise people to get rid of cars and to buy more environmentally friendly, healthier forms of transport. But I'm going to put top something we've already talked about, which is the low traffic neighbourhoods, because I think if we do that, pretty much everything else follows. If up and down the land, in every town that people lived, we've just pushed cars out of the residential streets and the stuff, and it all went onto the arterial roads, or as much as possible. I think that would then drag a lot of the cultural shifts along behind it. So for me, that's the big win.
Ian. You're on mute, Ian.
I was saying I've only managed to scribble down two because Tom didn't speak for long enough. So the two I managed to write down as Tom was speaking are, I think on the one hand, you know, we really need to potentially reevaluate the economic view we have of motoring. So and there's two aspects of that. On the one hand, we subsidize it left, right and center through society swallowing the externalities of motoring in a way that we refuse to do with public transport, for example. But there's also the slightly unacceptable economic analyses of, say, the value of time. So if you walk up the street, your time is modeled as being fundamentally less valuable than the person driving up the street, with no notion of what your journey is. So the person walking might be on the way to give bone marrow, the person in the car might be on the way to go and commit an act of criminal violence, but the person in the car is given priority within our modelling systems. So I would fundamentally change that policy. And otherwise, and again, this echoes again something Susan said, I would reevaluate the hierarchy of streets, or reevaluate what streets are for. Streets are not roads. A street may have a road on it, but it is not a road. Its function is much wider than that. And we need to go back to that kind of 1, 2, 3, walking, other active modes, cars as guests last, within urban spaces, within residential spaces, and yeah, re-establish that hierarchy that places streets as being for people above all. And an explicit statement of that would be probably my main policy change.
Thanks, Ian. Susan.
Yeah, mine would be reducing dominance of road vehicles, and that would be through reducing parking, having 20-mile-an-hour speed limits in urban areas, and having a national road pricing scheme. And I'll be cheeky and add in a fourth, which is banning and enforcing pavement parking.
Super. And Suzanne.
Yeah, I think combination of carrot and stick at both ends, really, and planning reform in terms of particularly with regard to parking. So we're seeing the perverse situation whereby we have planning applications turned down because they're not providing sufficient residential parking, which is absurd. We're just perpetuating that car dependency of our communities. So I'd like to see radical planning reform. Cycling on prescription, I know we've already seen that discussed recently. I'd like to go a step further and actually prescribe bikes in their own right. I totally agree with Susan on road pricing. We've subsidised motor vehicles for far too long and subsidised fuel and again absorbed those externalities. I'd like that to be reversed, and also business mileage. So my fourth would be a reform in terms of, at the moment, I think it's 20p per mile for bikes and 40p pence per mile for cars, but I'd like to see that addressed to actually incentivise sustainable transport for business use as well.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you everyone. We've got a couple of minutes over, so I'm just going to finish just a couple of minutes at the end. Really grateful to all of our speakers, been really interesting, and I suspect we could all talk about cycling and walking for hours and hours, so we have to stop at some point, but really we're very keen to sort of continue the debate and play our part, and we'll perhaps explore whether we can do a bit of writing around this, pulling together, you know, we've basically got our recommendations now, so we don't have to really do very much work, quite frankly. You know, we can just copy those and get them out. But actually, if that's what we think works, then let's do that. So we'll have a think about that. I just want to reflect on. I mentioned I work with a very small group of volunteers, and we run this thing called Cycle Bognor, and it's mainly sort of, you know, the average age of people is not in their 20s. Let's say that, you know, I'm not in my 20s anymore. We're a very mixed age group from sort of our 40s to our 80s, and we run sort of 5-mile rides, 10-mile rides to cafes, Saturdays, Thursday nights, and we've got one tonight, I should say, and I'm leading it. And I live in Bognor, and one of the things about Bognor is it really is windy. And I have to say that one of the other things about Bognor is it's mainly beautifully sunny, almost always sunny, but we are expecting rain tonight, and I really hope the other 4 people in my group cancel. But actually, more seriously, actually, I suppose what I really want to say is actually, the if you build it, they will come. We have a lot of people who want to join these rides at the moment. We do taster sessions at the moment. We're only allowed to do groups of 5, and they fill up immediately as soon as they're put on Facebook and things. I think that actually, you know, that having a combination of good provision and, you know, things like Cycle Bognor, small scale initiatives to encourage people to go down to their local cafe with a group of people, I think can really help. And for those of you who want to join Cycle Bognor, you can find details on the website. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thank you again. For more details about our future webinars, please do look at our website or join our mailing list. And you can follow us on Twitter and Facebook. We have our Future of Aging conference on the 3rd of December, which now is sadly going to be virtual, but we do have some great speakers, including Sir Jonathan Porritt, who's going to be talking about sort of climate change, and I suspect transport will come in across that agenda. We will let you know about our future seminars, and we will, I'm sure you will, I hope you will see a little report coming out from us, you know, following on from this seminar. So thank you very much all for joining us, and thank you all very much in terms of participants and the people joining, and for all of the questions. So thanks. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.